So I'm gonna go ahead and record this video so I can convert it to a YouTube video, and I will post it later on. So that's kind of why we have this ability. So if this ever does happen. Okay, so census is the entire population. We just did a census. They need to know how much money you're making, where you live, how many people live in your household, things like that, how many dependents you have, because that's going to be based off of how they're going to fund areas. Something like this pandemic, to know how many resources are needed and how many people will need those resources, they're taking information from the census. So if you were to lie on the census, or if you were to not fill out the census, then that could have a direct impact on the support that your area has. It's also illegal not to fill out the census. By law, you have to, and if you do not fill it out, they said on there that they will send someone to your house to ask you those questions in person. And if you don't do that, then they'll proceed from there. So I've never not filled out a census because I don't want someone coming to my house and asking me questions, but it would be, that's kind of their protocol. Sample would just be a representative part of the population. So if we just talked about the people of Peterborough, that would be a sample of the entire population of maybe New Hampshire or the United States, things like that. We have observations. Now, observations and experiments are both doing something to collect data, but an observation is you're not doing anything to what you're looking at. You're not changing for a response. You're not changing the variable. You're just observing. So even though you may tag an animal or you may create some sort of system, whether it be a camera or an environment, and you are just observing, that's not really an experiment because you're not doing anything. You're not giving a squirrel a robotic tail. Like, you're just watching them. So even though you are still doing something, such as tagging them or watching them or setting up a camera, it might ruin their environment in a way, but you're still just observing. Whereas if an experiment were to occur, then you're actually conducting some sort of treatment. You are doing something to a group to see the outcome of that experiment. Now, within an experiment, sometimes a placebo is necessary. A placebo is a placebo effect, rather, is when someone receives no treatment, but they believe that they are. This is controversial, but it's also thought to be essential in the experimental process. For instance, with the COVID vaccine, they had to give a group the vaccine, and they also had to give a group a placebo being something that they think is the vaccine but isn't. The reason why is they need a control group. They need someone to act the way they would if they didn't have the vaccine, but the mind thinks that you did. So if you were to develop COVID symptoms, they know that this is how you would have contracted COVID without any vaccine. Then they took a group with the vaccine and then they tested them to see how many of them contracted COVID. And if the numbers were less, if the vaccine group than it was in the placebo group, you can start to make the conclusion that maybe the vaccine works. But you couldn't make that conclusion unless you had something to compare it to. So the placebo effect is when you give a treatment and someone is aware that they are receiving something. They just don't know whether or not it's the vaccine or not. The group that gets the placebo, the one that has not been experimented on, is considered our control group. So the group which the treatment is not given and allows researchers to control for the placebo effect. You can split the group into two. Both groups are complaining of never-ending chest pain. One group receives the treatment, the other group receives the placebo treatment. You test their chest pain after a week. Has it reduced, or maybe within hours, whatever it is you're testing. Now that part of a group is split into two. What we talked about last week of our different sampling techniques, you could use any of those techniques to break them into two groups. So if the homework asks, how would you go about doing this? You could use a simple random sample and say that everyone gets a number, and then you use a random number generator, and the first 20 people selected go to group one, and then the second 20 people go to group two. You decide group one gets the vaccine, group two gets the placebo, something like that. So you're not just splitting it into two, you have some sort of logic based off of how you would do it. Now, the whole process of a placebo and a non-placebo and an actual treatment is called a randomization to treatment experiment. So this is used to assign individuals to two treatment groups using the random number table or some sort of generator. And the two groups are either the placebo group or the tested group. So that entire process is called a randomization two treatment experiment because you have two treatments going on, one with something, one without, but the brain doesn't know. Now, sometimes it might be necessary to do what we call a double-blind experiment. So a double-blind experiment means neither the individual nor the observer knows who's getting the treatment. So Moderna created a vaccine. They then had two vials. This one is the vaccine, this one isn't. They gave it to a research facility and said, hey, here's vial one, here's vial two. Let us know your results. Because maybe they didn't want other people to know what were going on. They wanted to keep it into their small group so that they can control what information gets released. That's now a double-blind experiment because the research facility that's implementing, that's giving the treatment, just knows vial one and vial two. They don't know which one's which. Then they inject into people's arms, the people that get the treatment, they don't know which is which either. So then the researchers write down the information saying, all right, group one had this many positive cases, group two had this many. Here you go. That's a double-blind experiment. There are always lurking variables, however. Those are unknown variables not accounted for. They might cause a change in the response to an experiment. So maybe the vaccine caused the coronavirus to no longer be detectable according to our testing. So now we have less people testing positive, but maybe they still have it. We don't know. That's just something that could be happening. Not that it is. It's just something that could be happening that there's no way of knowing either way. So there are always lurking variables that could be going on in the background that just is nothing that we can do to stop it. And then the last slide is just going over a few other things. Some of them are outdated, but the first one is just a survey. So that's asking a question to get a response. A Likert scale. We talked about that a few days ago. That's just a numbered scale based on feelings. So that would be ordinal, where how do you feel on a scale of 1 to 10? And you say 7, but what does 7 really mean? And how much greater is 7 than 6? And how much less is it than 8? We don't know. We just know that there is a progression. There are always pitfalls in everything. So I'm going to ask you to state your pitfalls in your survey because obviously once you go through, it's not until you're kind of getting to the final stages that you're like, I wish I would have done this. So pitfalls can happen. People could lie. There could be bias in wording, whether people are truthful or not. Maybe the sample isn't necessarily a good representation of the population. I always tell the story that one of the years I did this project that we're going to be doing, someone went around and asked how many pairs of shoes you owned. And what they found is that all the guys only owned a couple pairs of shoes and all the girls owned a bunch of shoes. And then finally, one guy stood up and was like, actually, I lied. I own, and said the number of shoes that they owned. And it was more than the average girl had owned. Then every single guy, well, almost every single guy, started to admit that every single one of them had lied about their number of shoes, because then you start to realize, well, I have basketball shoes, I have work boots, I have tennis shoes, I have cleats, I have this, I have that. And they realized that they really had a lot of shoes, but they were too embarrassed to say how many pairs they had. And maybe they didn't quite realize, well, I have 3 pairs of cleats, that's 3 pairs of shoes. So that would have been a pitfall, because maybe because they were being asked in front of everyone, people started to lie, but that just is human nature. So when you ask your question, since we are in a pandemic and it'll probably be something that will be digital, you won't really have to worry about that. But if you were in person, you have to be really careful about asking people in groups, because whoever answers first tends to be the most vocal of their opinion, and everyone else may follow suit. So it's not really going to be a true set of responses, which is why something like a systematic sampling would be pretty important, because if you just picked every 10th person, a group of 5 walks by, you're only going to ask one of them. So that kind of helps. But again, the person that speaks up will probably be the person that is the most vocal. Phone surveys, those don't really happen anymore. But back when people had landlines, numbers were listed, and a company could just call all the numbers that were listed and ask you questions. Today, your data gets shared, and so that's how you can be part of a phone survey, but most things are now electronic. So it's just another pitfall with phone surveys, is that people can just ignore the spam, or they those that do want to answer that phone call once again, are probably very opinionated and biased to the question. A bias, it can change an opinion. It has flaws in the experiment. That's why they do screenings with jury duty, that they ask you questions, and if you are biased at all, then you can't be on the jury. And then you get selected, and people try to lie so that they can be part of the jury and all that stuff. And so bias is very, very important. And then a voluntary response, it's just a very dangerous way to collect information. And that's unfortunately how a lot of you are going to collect your information, is that you're going to put something out there, and if people want to respond, then they will. So a voluntary response are only going to get those that have a strong opinion or that want to answer it. So these are kind of the vocab words of this section. The homework tonight is going to be asking you questions using this information.